Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 3. The Iroquois Theater Fire. On November 23, 1903, the Iroquois Theater opened in Chicago, Illinois. The owners opened it ahead of schedule, hoping they could generate more profits instead of opening in the dead of winter. But they claimed they didn't cut any corners. In fact, they claimed that the building was fireproof. 6 weeks after it opened, on the afternoon of December 30th, 1903, there was a performance of the musical Mr. Bluebeard. The theater had seating for 1,700 people, but with standing room, 2,000 people could fit into the theater. During the play's second act, around 3:20 p.m., audience members saw a flash from a spotlight that spread to the drapes. The stage crew attempted to close the safety curtain, but it snagged as staff tried stamping out the fire. At first, stagehands told the audience to stay calm as they attempted to extinguish the fire. Performers and the orchestra continued with the show, trying to ignore the blaze. The fire eventually spread, igniting oil-soaked robes and oil-painted backdrops. Panic amongst the theater attendees started to set in. The audience, primarily women and children, rushed for the exits. Staff and crew members opened side doors, causing a backdraft, which blew a fireball through the theater. Hotspots in the theater accelerated the fire. Despite having almost 30 emergency exits, audience members couldn't find the fire exits. The building owners didn't clearly mark the exits. Also, many of the doors were deadbolted to keep out trespassers. People rushed to the doors under the marquee. They only opened inward. As audience members piled against the door, people at the doors couldn't open them, leaving them all trapped. Several theatergoers in the balconies tried exiting through the second-story fire escapes. However, these fire escapes were not completed and the doors opened to nothing. Sadly, people were pushed out of the doors and fell to their deaths. In all the chaos, the fire department was nowhere to be seen. It turned out that the building's owners never correctly hooked up the fire alarm. One theater crew member ran to a nearby building and activated a fire alarm. By the time fire personnel arrived, it was too late. The fire had almost put itself out. The blaze lasted about 15 minutes. There was a, quote, eerie silence, unquote, as firefighters opened the door to find, quote, dead bodies stacked up in rows, unquote. According to one report, quote, audience members 6 and 7 feet deep they were found, not packed in layers, but jumbled and twisted in the struggle with one another, unquote. 602 people lost their lives that day, and another 250 were injured. The Iroquois Theater Fire is the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single-building fire in U.S. history. While it was never proven in court that safety inspections were negligent, an article in the Smithsonian Magazine claimed that city officials were indifferent to known violations. None of the theater owners faced legal consequences. There were rumors of possible bribery. Only one person faced legal charges connected to the fire. A bartender was charged with stealing from the bodies in the alley. The disaster prompted city officials to review and improve fire codes in the city. Afterward, public buildings required marked and lit emergency exits, fire alarms, and doors that open outward. Despite the tragic events of that day, the theater was rebuilt in 1926 and has changed ownership over time. In 2019, the theater was reopened as the Nederlander Theater, which still operates today. The legacy of the Iroquois Theater Fire stays with the theater. Alleged hauntings ensure that. Many people have had ghostly experiences in and around the building. The cast and crew of various productions have seen shadowy figures moving on the balcony. People often smell smoke. In the backstairs, people have seen apparitions wearing turn-of-the-century clothing. Saturday Night Live alumni Anna Gasteyer told some stories about her experiences at the theater in an episode of Celebrity Ghost Stories. Gasteyer portrayed Elphaba during the Chicago run of Wicked from 2005 to 2006. One thing she talked about is the Death Alley. It's the alley where some of the audience members in the balcony fell to their deaths. Gasteyer said, quote, "It always had the gloomiest, darkest, most dismal. It was a terrible alley. It really was. It felt terrible," unquote. Gasteyer said there were scenes where her character flew, and as she was above the stage in a harness, she saw groups of people she described as, quote, "almost like families, gatherings of people that were together," unquote. But when she landed, no one was there. She also heard a child's voice when she was walking to her dressing room. Another time, when turning the corner, she saw a woman with a boy and a girl dressed in early 20th century clothing. Then, suddenly, they disappeared. Visitors have also come away with strange photos in Death Alley, such as the one on the screen. Some pedestrians in the alley have felt a cold hand reach for them or call their names. There have also been sightings of apparitions falling to the pavement. When one stage manager went into the alley for a cigarette break, he heard a voice say, quote, "The smoke will kill you," unquote. He looked in the direction of the voice and saw a woman wearing a hoop skirt who quickly vanished into thin air. There's also been strange occurrences on the 8th floor of the neighboring building. The building was used as a triage before bodies went to the morgue. The former Iroquois Theatre is one of Condé Nast Traveler's 42 most haunted places in the world, which was independently selected by editors and writers. Number 2. The Peshtigo Fire. The summer of 1871 was one of the driest summers in Wisconsin's history. Peshtigo, Wisconsin is on the banks of Lake Michigan. In 1871, it was a bustling logging town with a windware factory that made buckets and broomsticks from logs sent down by the Peshtigo River. The town had stores, hotels, factories, 2 churches, and a schoolhouse, which was impressive for the time. The area had a lot of trees. To build on the land needed to be cleared. Sometimes workers inadvertently caused small brush fires, but these could be easily managed. Small wildfires had previously crept up on the town of Peshtigo with little concern. However, on the evening of October 8, 1871, cold air intensified some of the brush fires, pushing them towards the town. Eventually, it became a firestorm. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a firestorm happens when, quote, "heat from a wildfire creates its own wind system," unquote. Researchers studying forest fires have found that firestorm winds can reach speeds of about 100 miles per hour and temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. As the firestorm swept through the town, houses and train cars flew off the ground and trees were torn from the soil. Survivors said that the firestorm was so loud they called it, quote, "the sound of judgment," unquote. Many people in the path of the firestorm didn't stand a chance. Strong gusts of wind tore children from their parents' arms. The smoke was so thick that evacuees could barely see as they ran. Others went blind when hot ash and cinder got into their eyes. Superheated air burned some people's lungs. Some dug holes in the ground, and others jumped into drinking wells. Townspeople rushed to the water for safety. But this caused another problem. Some people died of hypothermia in the cold water. Others drowned from staying underwater too long to avoid the hot air. 3 men who hid in a water tank were boiled to death. One girl, 16-year-old Helga Rotstad, attempted to flee the fire, but the intense heat ignited her hair. The flames then engulfed the teenage girl. Some overwhelmed residents simply laid down and let the fire consume them. In the aftermath of the blaze, the entire town was destroyed. Over 800 people died in the first hour. The fire continued to spread. By the next morning, 16 other communities within 1,875 square miles were destroyed. In total, between 1,250 and 2,500 people perished in the fire. The final number was difficult to tally, as the town records that weren't destroyed were spotty. Many victims were burned beyond all recognition and buried in mass graves. A big problem was entire families were wiped out, so even if the remains were recognizable, there was no one to identify those people. The Peshtigo Fire is one of the most devastating fires in American history. Oddly, another major fire catastrophe happened 250 miles south in Chicago on the same day the fire started. It's known as the Great Chicago Fire. About 3.3 square miles were destroyed. Over 300 people were killed and over 100,000 people were displaced. Although the Peshtigo Fire was deadlier, it is largely forgotten in the shadow of the Great Chicago Fire. There are odd witness accounts about the Peshtigo Fire. For example, several people claim they saw a black spinning object flying in the sky as the fire ripped through the area. In 1971, the Wisconsin Magazine of History published Father Peter Piern's eyewitness account of the 1871 fire. Piern was the local priest at the time of the fire. He wrote, quote, "When the hurricane burst upon us, many, surprised and terrified, ran out to see what was the matter. A number of these persons assert that they then witnessed a phenomenon which may be classified with the marvelous. They saw a large black object resembling a balloon, which object revolved in the air with great rapidity, advancing above the summits of the trees towards a house which seemed to be singled out for destruction. Barely had it touched the latter when the balloon burst with a loud report, like that of a bombshell, and at the same moment rivulets of fire streamed out in all directions. With the rapidity of thought, the house thus chosen was enveloped in flames within and without, so that the persons inside had no time for escape." Unquote. Some believe that this was a UFO. However, forest fire experts say what they most likely saw was debris floating above the flames. Other odd stories came from the counties of Outagamie, Brown, and Manotick. They are all within 100 miles of Peshtigo. German Catholics settled those counties. Shortly before the fire, people in these counties claimed they saw a demon who resembled a boy. One description of the demon was, quote, "a long fiery tail riding a large black multi-horned stag, spreading fire in his wake," unquote. As the fire spread to the community of Champion, a group of townspeople took refuge in the chapel. 12 years earlier, a Belgian immigrant named Adele Bryce built a shrine to honor the Virgin Mother after she claimed Mary visited her at the site. When residents left the chapel the following day, they discovered the area around the church had not been damaged. This event has since been called the Miracle of Fire. It's the only Marian apparition sighting officially recognized and approved by the Catholic Church in the United States. In 1951, on the 80th anniversary of the fire, a historical marker was erected at the mass grave in honor of the victims. The Peshtigo Fire Museum opened in 1963 on the site of St. Mary's Catholic Church, the first building that was built after the fire. The museum houses artifacts and stories from the fire. Visitors have claimed that the museum is haunted. Some have reported hearing ghostly voices, seeing apparitions, and smelling smoke. One visitor reported seeing the building engulfed in phantom flames. People have also claimed they have seen shadow people around the mass grave. The smell of smoke follows these ghostly apparitions. In September 2013, the Midwestern Paranormal Investigative Network investigated the museum and the surrounding area. The team's EVP equipment picked up multiple faint recordings. In some of their clips, a faint voice can be heard saying, quote, "I'm Rachel," unquote. On another recording, a voice can be heard saying, quote, "I'd assume you'd come here," unquote. Sadly, because of the brutal and terrifying way these men, women, and children died, and the way their remains were handled, it's not surprising that they are not resting in peace. Number 1. The Collinwood School Fire. March 4th, 1908 began like any other school day at Lakeview School in Collinwood, Ohio. The school's custodian, Fritz Herder, arrived at 6:30 a.m. to turn on the furnace, ensuring the school would be warm when classes began. Fritz then went to work in another part of the school. At 8 a.m., 366 students settled in for the morning. Tragically, around that time, the furnace malfunctioned. The steam pipes under the first floor joists became so hot that the heat ignited parts of the floor. The floors were oiled, which was standard then, and the mainly wooden interior caused the fire to spread quickly. Fritz, the father of 8, 4 who attended Lakeview, noticed something strange as he worked. Fritz said, quote, "I was sweeping in the basement when I looked up and saw a wisp of smoke hurling out from beneath the front stairway. I ran to the fire alarm and pulled the gong that sounded the fire alarm throughout the building. Then I ran to the front and then to the rear doors," unquote. Fritz opened the doors to let the students escape, but this only made things worse because oxygen intensified the blaze. Then the doors blew shut. In a state of panic, Fritz ran to the classroom of his 13-year-old daughter, Helena, and urged them to leave the building. Fritz said, quote, "I cannot remember what happened next, except that I saw the flames shooting all about and the little children running down through them screaming. Some fell at the rear entrance, and others stumbled over them. I saw my own little Helena among them. I tried to pull her out, but the flames drove me back. I had to leave my little child to die," unquote. Meanwhile, students in other parts of the school assumed that the fire alarm was a drill. It was only when they made it down one of the stairwells that they realized the fire was real. Some students attempted to run past the flames, while others retreated up the stairs. 28-year-old teacher Catherine Weiler attempted to escort her 39 second-grade students out of the school through the rear doors. There were 8 children there struggling to open the doors. When the doors didn't open, they panicked. Then the students started to pile up at the door. Weiler attempted to pull the students from the pile-up and open the doors, but students trampled her to death. Meanwhile, students tried to escape through the front doors. Students flooded the area, overcrowding the vestibule leading to the front door. As some students tried running back, more ran towards them, trapping them all in the vestibule. Frantic parents and workers at a nearby train yard rushed to the school to help. Some students escaped, only to run back into the building to save their siblings. Fire crews would later find the bodies of siblings holding each other. Rescuers tried opening the doors, but they were unable to. The workers from the rail yard, quote, "kicked and pounded on the solid wood doors until their fists were bloody," unquote. They ended up smashing windows and helping students out of the school. Fritz Herder, who was still in the building, handed children out the windows. His hands were scorched black as he stayed in the building as long as he could. He then escaped himself. Eventually, the rear doors broke open because of the weight of the students trying to force their way out. The pile of bodies had reached almost 6 feet high. Rescuers desperately tried pulling the children from the tangled piles, but the flames forced them back. They had to watch helplessly as the flames swallowed the children. Finally, the front doors also burst open, spilling out another mass of children. Most of them were already dead. One parent, Wallace Upton, found his 10-year-old daughter in the pile. She was trampled and badly burned, but still alive. Upton tried saving her, but he couldn't free her from the pile. Upton was severely burned in the process and refused medical treatment for hours. In another story, a mother came to help, only to find her daughter stuck in a pile of students. Unable to pull her out, the mother held her daughter's hand as she passed away. The Collinwood Fire Department wasn't prepared for the carnage. The crew, which was mostly made up of volunteers, was slow to respond. The fire department only had one horse-drawn wagon, and it was about a mile from the school when the fire started. When they arrived, their hoses didn't have enough water pressure to reach the second floor, and their ladders weren't tall enough to reach the third floor. However, even if there was something they could do, it would have been futile at that point. The fire had become too intense. The blaze torched the interior of the school within 30 minutes. As the fire wound down, firefighters and rail workers spent hours untangling the bodies. Cleveland Fire Department's battalion chief, Michael Fallon, described pulling the bodies from the charred ruins. He said, quote, "Under my supervision, the men worked with shovels for about 1 hour, but found this method very slow and rather difficult, as up to this time we had only got about 10 bodies, owing to the entangled masses of burned bodies, and as I wished to extricate the bodies without any mutilating, I then decided to float the bodies by putting a large stream of water under each of them, therefore creating pressure, which proved satisfactory. The bodies floated around like beef in a vat. After this, our work was easy. We were hampered some on account of the parents of the dead children, who were clamoring to get a glimpse of these little darlings as they were taken from the ruins of the building to stretchers and ambulances." Unquote. The bodies were taken to a nearby railroad shop that was used as a makeshift morgue. The bodies were arranged in lines of 10. Some bodies were so charred that parts fell off as they were being moved, making identification even more challenging. A crowd of grieving families descended on the shop, desperately hoping for answers. Family members were allowed to enter the morgue, 10 people at a time, to identify their children. Some students were burned beyond recognition, leading to some bodies being misidentified. Other bodies were unidentified because their remains were not recognizable. Others went unidentified. 19 sets of remains were not found. One of them was Catherine Wheeler, the heroic teacher who attempted to save the students. In total, the Collinwood fire claimed 175 lives, 172 students, 2 teachers, and 1 rescuer, John Cracknick. He was one of the first to arrive on the scene. He was last seen running into the burning building. Almost half of the 366 enrolled students were wiped out in minutes. Collinwood residents were outraged and looking for someone to blame, so they turned their attention to Fritz Herder. A crowd of 500 people turned up at his home hours after the fire. Police had to patrol the area to protect his home. Fritz and his family stayed inside. The next day, 3 coffins with the remains of 3 of his children were delivered to his family's home. The bodies of 3 of his children, 15-year-old Walter, 13-year-old Helena, and 8-year-old Ida, were found huddled together on the second floor. Fritz had also been burned in the fire, and he was wearing bandages. When people saw the coffins and the bandages, they departed the area. Investigators determined Fritz was not responsible for the school fire. Fritz worked as a custodian at local schools until the age of 70. He rarely spoke about the fire. He died in 1958 at age 96. While most families decided to hold private ceremonies, the town purchased a plot of land for a mass grave for unidentified victims. Families that couldn't afford funeral expenses were also allowed to bury their children in the same area. Funeral services were held from sunrise to sunset for almost 3 days. There were not enough funeral carriages to carry the coffins, so many had to use their own wagons to bring their dead to the cemeteries. The burnt ruins were moved off the land, and in its place the town planted a public garden to memorialize the victims. The large memorial in the center had 175 tiles, one labeled with each victim's name. Initially, it was believed that the students could not leave through the doors because they opened inward. However, it was later determined that the doors opened outward. A major problem with the doors was that the knob latches were hard to open. With a stampeding herd of children, the students couldn't open the latches. Also, a report on the fire said that the inner vestibule doors leading to the main front doors were too narrow. This caused a bottleneck of students. Also, the fire escapes from the higher stories did not reach the ground. The report also said that the building's design acted as a chimney, forcing fire upward and burning the school's interior much quicker. Over 100 families lost a child due to the fire. In the aftermath of the fire, many families experienced strange occurrences. They claimed to have seen their deceased children in their homes. Some heard voices in another room, and when they go into the room, no one is there. After the building was destroyed, the Collinwood Memorial School was built in the neighboring lot. It was closed in 1970. Residents who lived close to the abandoned memorial school said they have seen a bright light flashing in a second-story window and then moving down the hallway. People who were brave enough to venture into the building have claimed to have felt drops in temperature and cold spots. They have also heard children screaming. The memorial garden, which closed in the 1970s, was also a source of strange paranormal activity. Visitors claim that they have smelt the stench of smoke so putrid that they left the garden. Recently, the memorial school was demolished and replaced with another school. So far, there have been no reports of paranormal activity. So hopefully the spirits of the 172 children and 3 adults who lost their life that day are finally resting in peace. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.